Good morning. We can never be satisfied with these tape recorders until they make one that can carry the beauty and the smell of Hawaii out for those who are listening, because it isn't fair that they should have to listen to this part of the message without the background. There are a few questions presented to us every time a new student turns to a truth teaching. And you will hear these questions so often that if you're not careful, you'll get weary of them. But don't. Let them be fresh every time they are asked of you, because they are the most natural and most legitimate questions in the world. And the world is entitled to an intelligent answer, which it cannot get, incidentally, any other place. The most frequently asked question in the world is, how is it, if there is a God, that there can be so much sin, disease, death, lack and limitation, wars, evil on earth? How is it, if there is a God, that these horrors can take place on earth? And the answer that has always been given is, we do not know where evil comes from or how it starts. We just know it's here, and perhaps that's God's way of chastising us or punishing us or waking us up. For what? For what? What have we done? Now, you know the answer to that question, because you have the answer in the 91st Psalm, in the 15th chapter of John, in the 8th chapter of Romans, in Galatians, in Philippians. And the answer is always the same. If you dwell in the secret place of the Most High, none of these things can come nigh your dwelling place. If you acknowledge that you are the branch, that the invisible Christ in you is the vine, and that you are all one in God, and that in that union with God you bear fruit richly. But when you lose that word, or loose it, or let it out of your consciousness, when you do not hold that word in consciousness, then you are as a branch that is cut off and withereth. So that in the end the responsibility comes down to the world's ignorance of its conscious oneness with God. And none of us are guilty of having inaugurated that or perpetuated it, and so it would seem that we have no right to be punished for it. But the law says that we are punished even for the violation of laws we do not know exist. And so we are. Only as an activity of truth takes place in your consciousness do you become separate from the iniquities of human living, the discords and inharmonies. There is no outside God or mysterious power that can let you go on in ignorance of the law without the penalty of the law. And so it has nothing to do with an outside God. It has to do with an activity of truth that takes place in your consciousness, revealing to you the nature of God and your oneness with it. That is why one person may be a better healer than another person, not because God is any different for one than another, not because God will operate in or through one to a greater extent than another, but because the one is maintaining themselves in a higher degree of conscious union with God than another. In other words, the responsibility always rests within ourselves as to what degree of conscious union we maintain with our source. It is not a bit different than the pianist or the violinist or the singer. The degree of their expressed harmony is the degree of their willingness to practice, and not only time of practice, but correctness. A person may well practice 10 hours a day and never learn to play piano, violin, or to sing. That is conceivable, because they're not going about it in the correct way. There are people driving automobiles on the road 10 years that still do not know how to drive and are continuously involved in accidents. It is because they have never learned to drive correctly, although they may be driving 6 and 8 hours a day on the road. It is not always our zeal. It is not always the time we put into it. It is the correctness. Many people have been practicing or studying metaphysics 30 years who know no more about it now than they knew in the first year, because they have never had the principle correctly given to them. And so, while they may have been diligent in their study and practice, they were diligent in incorrect study or incorrect practice. And that will get them just nowhere. So it is with us. There are principles. If we practice in accord with that principle, if we abide in the correct word, we will develop the consciousness. Now, the question then is, how can there be a God and all of these discords in the world? And the answer is, there is a God, but there is not a God in this world. In spite of tens of thousands of churches, there is still no God in this world, because there isn't a church on the face of the globe that worships God. There isn't a church on the face of the globe that knows God. There are individuals in every church who have contact with God. There is no church that has contact with God. The contact with God cannot be through a church. It has to be through an individual. There is no such thing as mass contact with God, nor vicarious contact with God. Ah, yes, I may have a contact with God, and you in some degree benefit by my contact, but that's all. In the end, if you do not make your own contact, you will be benefiting only in a very minor degree. It is not possible for a church, for a priest, for a bishop, for a cardinal, or for a pope to make your demonstration for you. They can, just as we can, reveal to you the 91st Psalm or the 15th chapter of John and ask you if you are letting the Word abide in you, and that is the way toward salvation. That is their function. That is our function. Now, God does not enter the affairs of men except through the consciousness of the children of God. A letter comes yesterday from a city asking if it is possible to give help in a matter of, again, a strike. And the strange thing is that it's only a few weeks ago that in that very same city, a similar situation was handled without a strike and with harmony in another industry. And yet the answer had to go out, no, we cannot specifically help this one. Why? No one here has asked for the help. That is, no one involved in the situation. In other words, if you do not ask for help for yourself or reach out for it, no one can inflict it on you. Yes, there are times when a parent can ask help for a child, or when we can ask help for those not mentally capable of asking for help for themselves, or sometimes not physically capable. But that is another thing. A direct contact has been established through someone close to the person. But where it comes to our neighbor over here, our knowing the truth here, our conscious realization of God may bring some degree of harmony to them. It may bring an awakening to them eventually. It may even bring a healing in their family if one were immediately necessary. But that is about as far as it would go, until they themselves open their consciousness to the Spirit of God. And so let us remember this. In proportion as we open our consciousness to the activity of God, just in that degree do we receive it, until that moment of transition when it takes over completely, and then from then on in, we live in that atmosphere, and it is always living our lives, and we have no further concern. But up to that moment, the responsibility is on our shoulder. We may reach out to that God today and have a healing. We may actually bring the presence and activity of God into our experience to such an extent that we have a wonderful healing. But that doesn't mean that we're going to have all harmony tomorrow, because in the early stages of our student days, disciple days, the very moment we have received the benefit of the activity of God, our thoughts go back to our human way of living and our human concerns and our human anxieties, and we shut ourselves off again. Then, in some trying moment, we reach out and establish that contact again, and again we receive a benefit. And then again we go back to our human ways of living and thinking, and this goes on for a time until we awaken to the fact that we're having too many of these healings and then discords, and then more healings and more discords, and we give a little more attention, probably a daily attention, to this union with God. Then we find that we're having quicker healings, better healings, more healings, or we're having less need of healing, because now the activity and realization of God is occupying more of our consciousness than it had been up to now. All right. As we continue in that way, we find that instead of giving 30 minutes a day to the realization of God, eventually we're dwelling in God 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours in a day, and in that degree we are experiencing more of harmony, less of discord. And so that goes on until the first thing you know, we find that if we could measure a 24-hour day, that probably the thought of God or the Christ or spiritual truth was active in us for 7, 8, 9, or 10 hours out of the 24. By that time, we are right on the verge where the balance swings over into the other side of the scale, and it takes us over. And then we no longer have to give thought to it. We never have to think about making conscious contact with it. It has made contact with us, and it maintains itself as our consciousness, and then everything we do is a spontaneous action because it is its action expressed in and through us. And then these evils of the earth, the snare, the fowler, the pit, the fall, none of these things come nigh our dwelling place. And so always have available the answer to that question, how can there be a God and all of these discords also? There can be until God is made an activity of our individual consciousness, until the Christ actually fills us and becomes the law unto us, the soul, the spirit, the animating principle of our being. Then we find that heaven and earth are one. The harmonies of heaven have become the harmonies on earth. But that can only be through union, through the activity of the Christ consciously realized within our own being. Probably the question that would come second is, why did the Master say, ask and it shall be given to you? And I have been asking all my life and I haven't gotten yet. Why have people for several thousand years been asking God for safety, security, health, peace, protection, and haven't gotten it? Why do they go to church once, twice, 3 times a week to ask for new automobiles and new houses and new marriages and new divorces and all the rest of these things, and do not receive them? And the answer is that you ask amiss. God is a spirit, and when Jesus said, ask and it shall be given to you, he assumed, I imagine, that you wouldn't take one statement out of its context, but that you would view his statement in view of his teaching. His teaching is that God is spirit. And what then could you ask of a God that is spirit except those things that are spiritual? You see, Scripture says, I have never seen a righteous man begging bread. And then you look around this world and you say, but I have. And so you have to come back to the question of then, what is a righteous man? Perhaps our concept of a righteous man has nothing to do with the scriptural idea of a righteous man. And you'll find that's where the difficulty is. We look upon a righteous man who is one fulfilling our concepts of righteousness. But who says that is God's concept of righteousness? What is God's concept of righteousness? And there again, God is a spirit. A righteous man is one who is living in accord with spiritual vision or spiritual qualities or spiritual activities. One who governs their whole affairs in accord with spiritual acts, spiritual thoughts. Oh, then the person says, I go to church 7 times a week. Yes, and going to church 7 times a week has nothing to do with being spiritual. One may go to church 7 times a week and still be asking for material things and desiring material modes and means of living. In other words, one can go to church 70 times a week and still be looking for more fish for their nets, or larger fish, or better quality fish. Whereas spirituality consists of leaving one's nets, leaving one's dependence on the ordinary human forms and modes of activity. Righteousness, in the spiritual sense, would mean a reliance upon the infinite invisible for those things that the world seeks from men, or things, or conditions. The righteous man would be the man who would say, do not fight, stand still, see the salvation of the Lord. The world would call that a do-nothing attitude. It wouldn't be a do-nothing attitude. It would be doing that which is almost impossible to do for the human. The righteous man, according to spiritual standards, would never have his vision going out to man whose breath is in his nostril for anything. He could give, share, or even receive from or with any or every individual on earth, and yet not be looking to them. He might have millions in the bank in securities and never once have a thought that these were his supply. Still would have in his mind the fact that spirit is the source and the substance and the reliance, and my vision is in that direction. The spiritually righteous man may have all of the good things of life, the houses, the homes, the yachts, the fine cars, and everything else, and enjoy them, and yet have no trace of sensuality, or greed, or lust, or indulgence, since these would all be a suffer it to be so now, and yet I find my inner life to be my reality. That would be his reaction. Enjoy these today if they're here, but don't be concerned tomorrow if they are not. And so, this subject of ask, knock, comes back to a correct sense of prayer. It all comes back to what is prayer. And in the last analysis, you will find that while there are degrees of prayer, there are steps in prayer, that the actual spiritual prayer is complete silence, a refraining from desire, a refraining from seeking, a refraining from words and thoughts. It becomes a state of receptivity. It becomes a quiet, as if listening. That is when you get into the very highest realm of prayer. Because now you are seeking nothing in the world of effect. Nothing in the world of effect. You have no desire in this world. There is only one desire, and that is for this feeling of union, this awareness of oneness. You see, to have that feeling with an object in mind defeats it. To have that feeling of wanting a union with God because of something to be achieved by it is what defeats it. Because it makes of God a means to an end. And that's an utter impossibility. That is something the world has not learned in any of its teachings. That it is an impossibility to use God as a means of achieving something. God is itself the object of our desires, of our prayers, of our meditations, of our communion. Not God for some reason, not God for some purpose, only God. Now there is no use talking that James knew when he said that if you pray and do not receive, it is because you pray amiss. What is it you want to receive? And if the answer is anything but God, be assured of this: the prayer is amiss. The world, for some reason, cannot seem to grasp the fact that in attaining God, one has attained all there is in life, that there is nothing beyond that. There can be no joy in anything, regardless of what it may be, even health. There can be no joy even in attaining health. Because once God has been attained, there is fulfillment on every level of consciousness. Matter of fact, in attaining God, you go a step beyond health and wealth. In attaining God, there is no such thing as health, and there is no such thing as wealth. There is only the infinity of harmony. There is no sense of a lack of any nature. There is no sense of anything to be attained. There is a state of self-completeness when God has been attained. Now, Scripture states this very clearly. Nowhere in Scripture does it say that God will provide a fortress for you. It doesn't say that God will provide. It says that God is. God is life. God is a fortress. God is the high tower. God is the rock. God is the house. God is the salvation. God doesn't provide these because there is nothing beyond God. There is not God and something for God to provide. God is itself the all and everything of being, and in attaining God, there is nothing left to attain. Not even health or wealth or satisfaction or peace or safety or security. There are none of these left to attain once we have attained the conscious realization of God. Nobody can explain that to you. Nobody can define that or analyze it for you. That is something you have to feel with your spiritual discernment, that in having God, you have it all. You can't even translate that in terms of saying, oh, if you have God, you'll have home too, or you'll have health too. You cannot do it because you are still saying God and something. You are still thinking of God as a means to an end. God is not a means to an end. God is the end. Now, you see that there would be no such questions if it were understood that God actually is the ultimate of attainment. Once it can be ruled out of people's consciousness that in finding God they will have things added unto them, but come to the realization that in finding God they'll find harmony included in them, then will come the end of the search for God. You see, anyone can end the search for God very quickly once they realize that even finding God isn't going to get that thing for them that they are thinking of, which is beyond God. In other words, the moment we come to the realization that God itself is the object of our search and for no purpose, in that moment comes the realization, I am in the midst of thee. Where thou art, I am. Where I am, thou art, for we are one. There is a peace that passeth understanding. That peace will never be realized by any individual who has a desire. The peace that passeth understanding only comes with a realization that there is nothing to be desired or hoped for. That is not as simple as it sounds, but let's see if we, they say hunger feeds on the food you feed it. The more you feed your appetite, the greater your appetite grows. And it makes no difference whether it's in the line of food, or whether it's money, or whether it's the pleasures of the world. Whatever it is, the more you indulge them, the greater your capacity for wanting more of them becomes. And so it is that if we could all have our desires fulfilled in this moment, our desires other than God, you'd be surprised how very few hours would elapse until another desire came along. And then you'd be setting out on that goal. It isn't any different than bird having to find the North Pole and then not being satisfied until the South Pole and then having to go on to the Antarctic. No one is ever going to satisfy Admiral Byrd so far as his human desires for the conquest of time and space are concerned. And that is not anything detrimental to him, because he is not a man who is doing it for reputation or pride or wealth. He just has an innate love of life, and that can only be satisfied as he expands in time and space, and humanly that is very laudable. But So I don't say that in any critical way. But I do mean that as long as the desires are for anything in the human world, $1 million begets 2 million, and 2 million begets 5. Because nothing has ever been discovered in the world of effect that really satisfies. It doesn't make any difference what it is. Or if I could only be President of the United States, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. There's no limit. There's no limit. There's no limit to desire, because desire begets desire. When desire is gone, and that does not mean settling back into lifelessness, but when desire for the objects of life are surrendered in the realization of God as fulfillment, then one's activity spreads just as far and wide as Admiral Byrd's does, but always accompanied with the peace that passeth understanding. And incidentally, I wouldn't be surprised if he himself has attained that peace that passeth understanding, that even in all of his wanderings, this peace goes with him, because he has no ambitions with his desires. Now, very often, people misunderstand the mystical way of life because they believe it is a life of do nothing or accomplish nothing, or sit on a mountaintop or by the seaside and dawdle. That is not true. To live in the peace that passeth understanding without desire brings one such activities as eventually one can say, I don't even have time to get it all done. But there is no unfulfilled desire. There is no stress and strain after something. Everything is accomplished in and with and through an inner peace, just as if this work had to be done this minute, but without any mad thought about an hour from now or 6 hours from now or tomorrow. Again, I find it very difficult to explain, but I can say this, that if we could find a moment when we're alone to put all of our human cares out of our thought and the realization, yes, I can truthfully say that at this moment I will be satisfied if I achieve the realization of God. I'm perfectly willing for the next moment to take care of itself. If in this moment I can attain that peace that passeth understanding, that realization of God without any motive, without any object, without any desire, just for the sake of sitting here this next hour or next 5 minutes, seated right in the heart of God. Whether or not it would come at that very moment, it would eventually come. It would eventually come, as long as we take the time out to realize, now I'm not sitting down for my health or my wealth or the peace of the world or to settle strikes or for the success of the United Nations. In fact, I don't care about my neighbor today. I care only about God, the realization of God. Might be selfish, might sound selfish, but that's the way it has to be. I'm seeking only the kingdom or realization of God. And if one remained that way for a few minutes each day, eventually that peace would descend, and one would find themselves wrapped in God, enfolded in God, even though it lasted only a moment or 2 or 3. But continuing that practice would bring the moment when the transition would take place and the realization would come. This is it. This is it. And then from there on, every bit of work given one to do would be done as if God were doing it, performing it. It would never be done with desire or ambition or hope of accomplishment. It would merely be done as an instrument of God. This has to be done. God has given it to me to do. Let's get it over with. And so, each one of us must, even if we begin with one period a day and gradually increase it, each one of us must have such periods for the realization of the Christ. We must have this period with no object, with no desire to attain anything for ourselves, not even healing. But we must go beyond that. We must not even be praying for our friends or neighbors or enemies or for the world. We must have no object whatsoever except the attaining of the realization of the activity of the Christ. Now let us see what this just would mean in our experience. Supposing that at this second the figure of Jesus Christ was standing beside me or were within me, won't make any difference in the long run where it is, and were to say to me, I am here, and I will never leave you nor forsake you. I will be in advance of you, one step, the rest of your days on earth. Tell me now what I would ever have to take thought for. Oh, let's go a step further and imagine that this figure of Jesus Christ is beside me or within me in this room now, and were to say, I am here. Could any evil befall this room or anyone in this room? No, because in the presence of that Christ, the Spirit of God, the Son of God, multitudes would be healed and multitudes would be fed of those who were congregated there together. And so you see that without thinking about you, if I were just to be selfish enough to think of myself and desire only that I have the realization of the activity of the Christ here and now, I would automatically be placing you in the presence of Christ, wouldn't I? All right? Now, supposing each one of us in this room heard the voice or felt the touch or received some awareness that the presence and activity of the Christ was with us. Where could we go the rest of this day that we wouldn't be a blessing to everyone on the road, in the business, in the home? That is, everyone who was at all receptive to spiritual things. There would still be some materialistically minded men and women, atheistically minded men and women, who would not perceive that Christ and who would not benefit because of their lack of perception. But most of the people that we would meet on life's highway would be blessed. Why? Because of the actual presence of the Christ. That is why I say, if we are a group of people who, without having any object in mind, merely set out to attain the conscious realization of the presence and power of the Christ, we will then not only be having that which will be a fulfillment unto our own experience, but unto everyone who touches the hem of the robe, whether or not we even know that they touch the hem. Do you see that? Now that is the point that I have tried for a long time to convey, but without success. I have never been successful in, except to a few individuals, of getting across this idea that God is itself the object of our search, and for no other reason than God. That we have no need of the activity of the Christ to do something. We only have need of the activity of the Christ. It itself will do all the doing. It itself will be a light unto our feet. It itself will be the salvation unto our soul. It itself will be the multiplier of loaves and fishes. But for us to desire it for the multiplication of loaves and fishes would be to defeat our end. Because then we're not seeking Christ, we're seeking multiplication of loaves and fishes. Do you see that? We are not seeking God, we're seeking health. And that's why we can't find God. Because if we're seeking health, how are we going to find God? You usually find what you seek. If you seek health hard enough, you'll find it even without God. At least it'll be a physical sense of health. Now, seeking God must be just that, seeking God. Not seeking God and something, and not seeking God for something. Just seeking God. Try, and this is also for all those who are listening to these recordings, try to imagine what would happen if you, at this very moment, could feel within yourself or beside yourself the very presence and power, the very activity of the Christ. If at this very moment the finger should touch you and say, "Here I am," or the smile should look up at you and say, "Where do you think I've been? I am beside you, I am within you. Whithersoever thou goest, I go. I will never leave you nor forsake you. I am the presence that goes before you to make the crooked places straight." Oh, yes, those Bible citations are beautiful but meaningless. I am speaking now of having the actual experience or awareness of that. Now, I know this, that in any moment that I have an actual realization of the presence of God, somebody in our student body gets healed or supplied or benefited or enlightened or realizes the Christ. I know that. I've watched it over the years. I know this, that I have at times reached out to some of my own students for help. And when they have realized the Christ and had the actual feeling of the presence, I have been lifted up. I know that too. I know that it would be an impossibility for you to actually experience a feeling of God's presence and not have somebody during the day say that they were benefited just by visiting with you or talking with you. They might not even recognize what it was that healed them, but they'd be healed of something. It cannot be otherwise, because where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. Where the Spirit of the Lord is, wherever the conscious presence of God is, there is freedom, freedom in Christ, spiritual freedom, which to our sense would mean freedom from sin, disease, death, lack, and limitation. Well, let's rest a little while. Watch what a miracle this is. What a rest comes to you, mental and physical, the moment you achieve that realization of the presence. Watch how you'll understand why the Master could say, I have overcome the world. He didn't have a single problem in the world when he had attained Christhood. Not a one, because there wasn't anything that could come nigh that state of consciousness. The miracle that happens the very moment, the weight that drops off your shoulders, the weight that drops away even from this belt line, the tension that goes out of it, the very minute the presence of the Spirit is realized. It would seem as if not only the whole world fell off of one's shoulders, but you sometimes feel as if you were carrying it around the belt too. There's such a tension there at all times, or much of the time. And all of this drops away, and that is the first time in your life that you can truthfully say that you're without a thought, that you know what it means to take no thought, that you haven't anything to think about, really. You have only a rejoicing, an inner joy, an inner pleasure, and yet for no reason, because it is a sense of completeness or of perfection or fulfillment, and yet there's no such thought in the mind. The very moment that that Spirit touches us, and we know that it's there, that is the moment when our sins drop away, or our sinful desires, or sinful thoughts, or fearful thoughts, or doubtful thoughts, or sickly thoughts, painful thoughts, that drops away with the realization of that presence. Now, it may seem that I'm being very repetitious today, and it undoubtedly is so, but it is because of the necessity of catching that point that the realization of the Christ is the end of the demonstration. It's not the beginning of the demonstration. It isn't going to be the realization of the Christ and then something happening. The realization of the Christ is the end of the demonstration, because it is the fullness of demonstration itself. Do you see that? It's a most wonderful thing. Oh, I hope today that everyone can have this feeling of its presence before we leave this room, and then you will know that nothing again will ever satisfy you but living in that, because that's the end of all desire. I suppose it's even the end of all hope. There's nothing left to hope for, because now there is only fulfillment. Let's do it again. I have a feeling that you have caught today the reason why nothing further is necessary than this experience of the Christ. And I think that you'll find that you're much better equipped from this day on to turn your whole thought to that end, and actually not be seeing beyond it to some demonstration or the fulfillment of some other desire or desire other than, this one itself. I have the feeling that it has registered, that it is the realization of the Christ itself that is the demonstration. And so we let it rest there today.